It's Dave Johal once again. Pleased to be joined by my colleague, John T. How are you, John, for the Boxing
I'm good,
Voice?
Dave. How are you, mate? All right?
Yeah, good, good. We spoke anyway, but how was New Year for you? Was it decent?
Yeah, do you know what? I've been asking loads of people that when you go in the shop and when you're on the phone to someone, and every answer's the same. I had a drink at home. So, yeah, you couldn't go anywhere, but it was nice. I'm on dry January now, so I think it's day 5 or day 6 tomorrow. I'll be nearly a quarter of the way through the month.
Good stuff. And one of the things that we both watched in the lead up to the New Year was the Lennox Lewis documentary, Lennox Lewis: The Untold Story. Um, we're going to break this down for everybody today. John, initial thoughts on the documentary. What did you think?
Yeah, I thought it was really good, actually, to be fair. There were parts of it, certainly at the beginning, stuff I didn't know about his childhood. I haven't read a biography on him at all. So actually getting a little bit more about him, I thought they showed a lot of things about all his fights. So that was really, really good. There's a couple of bits I probably would have added in if it was me, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. But overall, good summary. I enjoyed watching it and would recommend anyone to watch it.
Yep, same here. I think it was interesting watching back because as he was fighting during the time, we were kind of living it through TV and so on and so forth. But it was good to take a step back and see this fantastic fighter in his prime and going through all his ups and downs, most of his ups and downs. And again, like you, we'll talk about what could have been in the documentary as well. But definitely worth a watch, guys. And we'll give you our sort of review at the end of this. But definitely worth a watch. So let's break this down then. I mean, one of the things that really stood out for me in the documentary, John, was about the acceptance of Lennox Lewis. I mean, Lennox Lewis was a fighter of the planet, Jamaican heritage, raised in England briefly, then went over to Canada, then came back. Um, you know, one of the things that Frank Maloney at the time said was, he was taking him over to football clubs and making him drink tea and doing all this promotional stuff. Do you think that was to his advantage? Do you think he was fully accepted straight away, or?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's not his fault, if you like, that he lived in lots of different countries. So you're right, he was born in England and raised very young in East London. And then he went over to Canada. But his family originally from Jamaica, I think, or in the Caribbean anyway. So his upbringing clearly had been lots of different places. Now, when I think of boxing, I think probably the country that follow boxing the most probably is America, certainly with their size of their population. So the Americans, I don't think, really warmed to him because they saw him as a Canadian. I remember at the time there were a few Brits around saying he's not British, even when he was winning. And I was like, what do you want about? He's not British. Of course he's British. I think you're right. He didn't have a set following where he was almost from that place. And I look at someone like Ricky Hatton, totally different example, but from the north of England, from Manchester, whether you're a Man United fan or a Man City fan, you love Ricky Hatton. Kind of Lennox Lewis didn't have that backing. He kind of, as you said, drifted from bit to bit. With regards to the promoting with Maloney and the drinking cup of tea, I get why he did that, but I think the Americans and the Canadians, they almost had him down as posh because he was English, which makes me laugh because I think a lot of Americans do think us Brits are posh. And for anyone who's listening to me right now, definitely I'm not posh. So that probably didn't paint him in a great light either. And I think a lot of people saw him as a big giant and a bit of a softie rather than, certainly in his era, and I'm sure it'll come up later in the interview, but Mike Tyson at the same time, same era, he was about there sort of like knocking everybody out and had this ferocious way about him. And Lennox was more of a gentleman, certainly the way he conducted himself. So yeah, if that answers that one.
I mean, a defining fight, one of his defining fights, one of many, for me, was the Razor Ruddock fight as well. I mean, that kind of cemented him as not this sort of tea drinking, limey as some of the American public saw him. I mean, that kind of cemented him onto the heavyweight mapping. What do you think of that fight as well? Ferocious power in that fight, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's a number of fights I think of when I think of Lennox, and that's definitely one of them. I think that made people look up and go, hang on a minute, this guy is the real thing. He's as good as Tyson. He's as good as anyone else out there. I don't think people expected him to win in that fashion, that explosive. And when, again, we'll talk about it in depth, I'm sure, but Lennox was very calculated. I found, he was a great boxer, one of the best heavyweight boxers that I remember. He wasn't known for just being ferocious knockout power like some of the others. But yeah, he definitely had that in his locker when he needed it, as you could clearly see.
And another sort of fight that comes to my attention as well when I was watching it was the fight, his first loss. I mean, there's no spoilers in this. Hopefully, people have followed Lennox Lewis's career as they watched the documentary and they've watched it from a nostalgic sort of point of view and picked up things as they went along. Nicely narrated by Dr. Gray as well. Fantastic.
Yeah,
was the fight with Oliver McCall. I mean, as I was watching that as a child, I kind of neglected the fact that there was Oliver McCall who was coming into the ring crying, in fact, literally crying. How do you think that would fare in today's boxing ring, John?
It's a really good question. I mean, I remember watching it. I was at home. I was about 18, 19. And it was a massive fight at the time. I think, in answer to your question, if someone was crying on a ring walk or as they entered the ring, I'd be surprised in this year that maybe whether the fight would go ahead, because the doctors would be looking at that thinking something's not right. To this day, I'm not sure if it was something wasn't right or whether there was a bit of play acting, because clearly he got the knockout on the night. As you said, it was the first time Lennox had been beaten, but it was very strange and surreal watching it, and it was really tough to watch Lennox get beat. What I loved about Lennox, though, as I'm sure most of the viewers do know, the 2 times he did get beaten, and this is why Lennox is definitely up there for me as one of, if not the greatest heavyweight boxer. And I know that's a big statement when you've got your Alis and your Tysons that people want to throw in there, but he got beat twice. Both of them were kind of flash knockdowns. I didn't have him getting schooled in either fight. It wasn't like he was embarrassed or exposed, and he came back and avenged both of those. He seemed to know exactly what to do to win the rematches. Also, like with Lennox, where when he changed trainers a couple of times, so he almost knew that it wasn't working and it was right to change. I do think in boxing sometimes you see people ditch trainers when they shouldn't, and equally they might have been with the same trainer for years. They lose their first fight and then they ditch the trainer probably when they shouldn't. But at this stage, or certainly the second time he got beat, he knew to change trainer. And when he went to Emmanuel Stewart, I found that very, very clever, especially on the back of that being from a defeat as well with that trainer.
Yeah, it was really good as well how the documentary went into the backstage sort of footage. Maybe this wasn't shown at the time, but conversations that Frank Maloney, now known as Kelly Maloney, when he said to Lennox, look, I think we should drop Pep Correa. And there was kind of a negotiation where, look, we'll see how this fight goes, and then we'll certainly have that discussion, because it all stemmed from, apparently, from what we've seen in the documentary, that Lennox Lewis only sparred 1 round whilst training for Oliver McCall. So I mean, what one could argue as well, and only the people behind the scenes know this, but when they were lesser opponents, did Lennox Lewis take his eye off the gas for a bit, and Larry Merchant in the documentary as well, and it was happening at the time, mentioned this to Lennox Lewis, later down the line when it was Hasim Rahman who
it's hard to actually know. Sometimes I wish I was a fly in the wall in these dressing rooms, and just, even if I never shared it with anyone else, just to know, it's very similar to the AJ fight against Ruiz. It's very easy when a heavy favourite or a dominant champion gets beaten by a big underdog, that straight away it's like they didn't train properly, they didn't prepare, they overlooked the opponent. All of those things could have happened, or maybe not. Maybe he was fantastically prepared, but he just got caught by the knockdown. But when you are hearing that he didn't prepare that much and didn't train that much, if that's 100% true, then you've got to think that he did overlook the fight. Lennox himself, I think it was the first defeat of his career. Some of the stories that were coming out, I think it was the promoter that was saying it, but he was too busy filming Ocean's 11.
Yeah, that was
and
wasn't it?
It was the second one, yeah. And again, had he have beaten Rahman in his second fight and won that, no one would ever have mentioned probably the filming of it. So, like I said, I think the best thing for me in both fights is that he came back and he avenged it. So it proved that he was the better fighter. So only been beaten by 2 people. I think there's only 3 fighters that have been beaten everybody they've ever faced. Ali, Lewis. I'm trying to think who the other one is now. I'm sure they're 3. It will come to me in a minute. But 3 fighters that have beaten everyone they've ever faced.
Yeah. With the documentary, one of the sort of criticisms I had, and it's a minor sort of critique, is I wanted to see a bit more of the second press conference with Hasim Rahman and Lennox Lewis, because at the time when things were happening, there was a lot of wrestling on the floor. Some people saying, look, it looks manufactured, but it would have been interesting to delve into that as well, just to find out what happened there, just to lead up into the fight. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definite. I think there were a few parts of the film, that being one, where I'd have liked to have seen more away from just the fight. So as I said, the documentary is great. We wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't, and I'd definitely watch it again and recommend it to anyone who likes the sport. But it was very much around the actual fights, most of which footage I've seen, as most fans have watched it. And if they haven't, they can look it on YouTube. I'd go back to even to the beginning of the film. I think it started off where it talked about maybe a tough upbringing for him in the tough streets of East London. His mother left him and had to move over to Canada to try and get a better life. So he was staying with a friend in London. He clearly wanted to mention her in the video that she wasn't too nice to him. And I think there was a belt involved where she was chasing him. It would have been very interesting to have his take on what that was. And also in terms of, you said, was he accepted by the British public? Could it have been that growing up, probably when that would have been for him more in the 70s, I would have thought, in England with Caribbean heritage, in terms of was there much racism going on? And certainly in this day and age, I'm not sure whether he had the opportunity to support what we call Black Lives Matters now, like many of our fighters and many sports people do at the moment. Had he have done that maybe when he was king of the world, if you like, it might have been a bit easier. In this day and age, there wasn't too much talk of that, because I'm sure there was a bit of that as well. Maybe it could have been a little bit more away from the fights, and that one being one of them that you've mentioned as well.
Yeah, and I think another thing as well, it was kind of leading up to the phenomenal sort of media circus, the fight with Mike Tyson, that crescendo. I think that was it was kind of building up to that. But I think it would have been great to see the Vitali Klitschko fight in there as well, or mention of Vitali, maybe the passing of the torch. And I know it's difficult to cram so much into an hour and 30 minutes. An hour and 30 minutes, isn't there, John? It would have been good if it was a slightly bit longer, and maybe delve into those sort of fights and touch upon the Klitschko dominance after Lennox Lewis.
Yeah, and I felt that bit was a bit disappointing, if I'm honest. It's almost like the ending wasn't what I was expecting it, because the way it took you through each of his major fights after Tyson, I thought that they would end it on Vitali. I can only imagine that they didn't, is because it got stopped because of a clash ahead. There was a cut, and I think some of the scorecards actually had Vitali ahead, and many experts will tell you that Vitali was winning that fight. So for me, it leaves a question mark. I would love to have seen that rematch. That would have been, if Lennox would have finished that, had the rematch, beat Vitali, there might not have been many arguments around it there. But some people then go, well, Vitali went on to reign for a long time, albeit shared it with his brother because they wouldn't fight each other. So the belts was, which is fair enough. But it would have been nice to know who would have won that, because so many times in this sport, as we all know, it's eras, and you'll sit there and say, well, Tyson would have beat Ali, and Ali would have beat Lewis, and AJ would have beat Tyson, all them kind of things. Actually, to have two people to have that fight, albeit Lennox was at the end of his career and Vitali was at the beginning, but we've seen many a time some at the end of the career against the beginning where they still win. Floyd Mayweather against Canelo springs to mind on that one.
Yeah, it was. I mean, looking at the cinematography and the way it was actually shot and the way the fights were put together, I can't really argue that. I mean, the opening by Dr. Dre and the narration throughout was great. It's a nice voice, a nice narrator. There's loads of footage on there as well. I wouldn't say loads, but there's a bit of Larry Merchant in there as well, who's graced our screens, and he's a great commentator. So it's good to go back to those interviews. Manny Stewart as well is in there, and it's great. I mean, where were you, John, when the upset between Lennox Lewis, and not the upset, sorry, that what we call a robbery, and even to this day, I'm not just saying that because we're British and we follow all sport, but that was a robbery, wasn't it? Holyfield, Lewis won. Shocking scorecards, wasn't there? Shocking.
Yeah, it was a robbery. I was at home, and we are biased, but when I look back, I think certainly over the last 10 years or so, we've been blessed at times by having double-figure world champions in this country. I think at one stage we had about 14, nowhere near that many at the moment. But back then, when Lewis was in his prime, there was a couple of them floating around. So it was even bigger when they fought. And that was a massive fight because it was very, very meant to be very, very close. And I had it down that he completely dominated that fight. Dare I say it, it felt like it was a bit of a stitch up so that the rematch should be done and make even more money. I know that a lot of people thought that. And I was gutted on the night, as you would be when it happens. But they went straight back in for the rematch, no messing around. I think it was about 8 months later. And when the rematch happened, the right result came out of it. Again, some might argue, you know, there's many out there that tell you Evander Holyfield's as good as many, but coming up from cruiserweight, he was fighting a proper big heavyweight, very similar in this day and age. You know, if you look at Usyk, I know he's not the most popular fighter or followed, but his boxing style, his IQ is fantastic. Can he really mix it with someone like a Tyson Fury or an Anthony Joshua with the sheer size of them? Boxing brain-wise, he definitely can. It's just whether he could. And I think Lewis was just too big, too powerful, equally very effective in both fights, to be fair.
Yeah, and for me as well, that's still, look, to be fair, if Evander Holyfield did that to Lewis in the first fight, and Evander Holyfield got robbed, I'd be saying, look, that's an injustice. And Manny Stewart in the documentary, and at the time as well, he hit the nail on the head and said, this is what's wrong with boxing. And we could argue as well that stuff hasn't at times moved on, has it? I mean, you know, we still get that wild decision.
It's the subjectiveness of the sport. I was watching, what did I watch at the weekend? Luke Campbell and Ryan Garcia. My son doesn't really watch boxing, but he'd heard of Ryan Garcia. He knows he's got 10 billion trillion followers on Instagram. So he sat and watched it with me. It was really nice because he enjoyed it. But he was like, why? And he was asking questions. He was like, why do you have 3 refs? And if you're saying sometimes they get it wrong, I think I was moaning about the Canelo and Golovkin first fight at the time. And he was like, why don't you have 5 refs? Why don't you have 9 judges or 9 judges? I was like, I don't think you get it. That'd probably just make it even worse because there's more opinion. It is very subjective. It's what you like. I didn't have that first Lewis Holyfield fight even close, to be fair, remotely. But where you do get fights that are close, sometimes it's styles. There's been some recent ones that have been a draw where the come forward fighter, a lot of people think that they've been robbed, whereas actually the defensive one maybe a little bit cuter and lands a few more punches. But yeah, definite robbery in that fight.
I mean, going back to the making of the documentary, one more thing I would have liked to see in there as well is that brief sort of stint as I'd say a bit of a mentor or a trainer to David Price when he was in the corner of David Price and helping him out in the gym. When I think was it his rematch against Tucker, wasn't it? So it would have been good to see just a bit more of that as well. But how much do you cram in to an hour and 36 minutes, I suppose? So overall, for me, the documentary was definitely worth a watch. But I would have liked to see a bit more, to be fair, because, you know, he's one of the, let's be honest, one of the best heavyweights we've seen in a very, very long time. You know, when people think of heavyweights, we think of Muhammad Ali, we think of Mike Tyson, we think of Big George Foreman, we think of Fraser, we think of Lennox Lewis. You know, he's synonymous with the sport, very intelligent ring generalship. What are your thoughts on that? Could it have been a bit longer? Would you like to have seen a bit more in this documentary?
I think it could have been different. I don't want to do it an injustice because I'll be honest, I didn't know what to expect. I just knew it was out. I didn't know whether it was going to be gritty. I didn't know if it was going to be more behind the scenes, whether it was going to be about the fight. So it was great, but like I mentioned before, I'd seen it all. I don't like comparing. It's a bit like we compare fighters in different eras, right? But if you compare the Tyson movie, it was gritty. There was a lot more stories about Tyson outside of the ring, the politics with it, his misdemeanors, if that's the right word to say, what he got up to. Now, I'm not saying Lennox isn't as interesting or crazy maybe as Mike Tyson, but there definitely would have been some more stories. And certainly when you said the acceptance piece at the beginning, it's almost like I see with Lennox this closed book a bit still. I don't see him much out there nowadays. You know, when I think of ex-pros, I'm not comparing Tony Bellew to Lewis, but Tony Bellew just retired all over TV, so you still see him. Lennox Lewis feels like he just disappeared and you don't really see much of him. You know, 1 or 2 huge fights you might see him. But I'd love to have known a little bit more, certainly about the childhood and certainly about some of the politics and things that happen behind closed doors in the game and the industry that the fans don't always see.
Would you recommend this, John? For
Yeah,
someone,
definitely.
for someone who first of all follows the sport, knows the sport, so yes to that. What about someone who doesn't? As a movie, as a
Yeah,
documentary?
so I think if you follow the sport, if you're a youngster who maybe wasn't watching Lewis in his era, so if you've been watching boxing the last 10 years or so, you may well want to watch it because you would appreciate how good Lewis was, because you get it all in one place rather than searching for bits on YouTube here and there. If you're someone of our age and a little bit older, then 100%, because you've already mentioned it, seeing some of the old faces, the referees, the trainers, and you think, oh yeah, you know, some of those faces that aren't around as it was, quite nostalgic. If you're not a boxing fan and you watched it, I'd still recommend it. I don't know if that's biased because I am a boxing fan, because I think that, as you say, he was a world champion for us, and he was the first British heavyweight champion since turn around the 1900s-ish, where Bob Fitzsimmons was the last heavyweight British champion. So I think we have to look and appreciate that. And we're a little bit spoiled nowadays, right? Because we've developed that sport in this country over in the modern era. So we've got the two Brits at the moment hold all the belts, yeah. So we're really spoiled. But if you go back before Fury and AJ, David Hay, obviously, he won a version of it. Not sure if there was another Brit before Lewis, was there, or in between.
Frank Bruno.
Frank Bruno, of course, yeah. But it shows you what kind of company they're in. So yeah, I'd have a watch. But definitely, if you're a boxing fan, great view.
And my thoughts on it. 100% worth a watch if you're a boxing fan. If you've seen the documentaries on Ali, I Am Ali was great. This is, I wouldn't say it's as good as, because that was, I think that probably had a bit more production over it, but definitely worth the watch, guys. This is a very well put together documentary. That it's up there for me, with, you know, good documentaries like Champs, for boxing documentaries. If you're not a boxing fan, definitely give it a go, because you get to see someone who, you know, he was a phenomenal athlete. I mean, if it was about, I don't know, Paul Gascoigne or something like that, and it was a great documentary.
I think that's the thing, by the way. You know, you've mentioned Ali. I mentioned the Tyson film. There's such big characters like Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson. And I don't just mean in boxing, I mean in sport or in the world in the last 50, 60 years. So when you are comparing, sadly, Lennox Lewis was a heavyweight world champion, just like those two other gentlemen we've just said. Actually, from a character point, lots of people who wouldn't follow boxing would definitely watch a Mike Tyson film because they'd go, well, I bet that's interesting. And that probably comes back to that acceptance piece again.
Yeah. But from an athlete, definitely worth watching this story to see someone who you'll see his prime, you'll see his falls, you'll see his rise again, three-time heavyweight champion of the world. You'll see it all. So for me, definitely get out there. It's available at the moment on. What did you watch it on Amazon Prime, or did you rent it from the iStore?
Yeah, no, I rented it on Amazon Prime. Yeah, it's on there.
So it says, I think it's up there in 4K, or definitely up there in HD, guys. Give it a watch, and it will definitely turn the nostalgia back. Days of FUBU, and you know, when people are in Champion and stuff as well. So it's good. And just for the ring walks as well, you know, Mike Tyson coming into DMX. You know, of boxing. You'll see the band as well. You know, you'll see those press conferences where Don King was, you know, leading them both on, and it's an interesting time, the 90s and the late 80s of the sport. You know, very interesting.
Some of the outfits, I remember wearing the same stuff, but when you look at people ringside, just like fans and that, and you're thinking, God, how long ago does that look? Yeah.
It's definitely worth a watch. Brilliant. Thank you once again, John. We'll catch you all on the Boxing Voice. No doubt we'll have some more interviews coming up. But Happy New Year, guys, and give it a watch.
Cheers, guys.
Yo, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to hit the like, subscribe, and share. As always, if you want to support us to the next level, head over to the patreon.com/ThaBoxingVoice. We have tons of exclusive, from Border Wars, Untold, betting shows, the list goes on and on and on. But in addition to that, if you guys have questions for fighters, trainers, and promoters, this is where you can submit them. We will run out, get these questions answered, and put it back on the show just for you guys. Appreciate it. Peace.